where he said something like, "Oh, I totally understand like your situation. Like sometimes my landlord's too cheap to even turn the heat on," and I was like, "What?" And I was like, "You have a net worth of supposedly $800,000, and you live in an apartment where your landlord is too cheap to even turn on the heat sometimes."
Okay, so I have a very lengthy message here. Um, and there's a lot of detail in here, but I'm really gonna just let you start where you would like to start. So you worked for, first of all, Smart Circle company. We'll at least
Right.
identify the parent company, and you know that for sure. Um, so what just kind of briefly tell us about this experience. You've obviously been out for a while. What still brings you to talking about it, even though you're out of it?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked because I wasn't anything like special in Smart Circle. I was just a sales rep. I was never like a top team leader or like an owner or like an assistant director or anything. But I really want to share my story today because the number one excuse I would always see from these Smart Circle offices was, "Oh, you just have a bad promoting owner," right? They would just, they can't teach sales right. They can't run an office right. I worked for what was considered one of the top offices in the AT&T campaign. Now, before I go any further, I just want to clarify what that specifically means. The top office in the AT&T campaign essentially means like best selling. So every single day, we would come into morning meetings and they pull up stats from like the previous day, and we were usually in the top 2 to 8 in terms of sales. Very rarely we were not in the top 10. We were bringing, at least Smart Circle say we were bringing tons of money. And we were just like, and they were also better trained at like vetting reps, like doing second round interviews, getting people to actually retain, like, stay with the whole program and whatnot. So that's ultimately why I want to share my story because really, like, even though my office was probably better at teaching sales and conducting second round interviews and whatnot, it's really still just Devilcorp. I want to like help expose like the myth that like, oh, you just had like a bad office and whatnot. Because in reality, it's just a bad business practice, and I want to help like explain my story. And so much really like happened in that 3 months that I still like come back to it because when I was in Devilcorp, it really just felt like I was in my own little like world. Like it was just such something I never like experienced before. Where I guess you could say that's kind of just like the dehumanization of the business. But like when I was there, it was just like such an, for lack of better words, out of body experience. Um, so yeah, I just want to share that, and that's why I keep coming back to it because one, I kind of can't get out of my mind because I've been out for a little bit. I've been out for like about 4, 5 months now, but I still kind of keep coming back to it just
Mhm.
because, like, it was enough. I want to get my story out there in both. I want to get my story out there, and I want to like, I still can't keep thinking about it because I experienced nothing like it before.
Right. And you're not alone. I think that's a very common trait for a lot of people, whether they contact me or they post on the subreddit or whatever, is that they keep coming back to it. And I mean, that's the whole reason that this film exists, the slave circle exists in the first place, is that same thing. Like it just kept coming back. So you were only there for 3 months. Um, but I mean, I could tell you put a lot of thought and care into writing this account of this. So it's obvious to me that, yeah, even though you were there for only 3 months and now you've been out for a few more months longer than we were even there, it still affects you in a pretty profound way. And to use your words, you say in this message, the reality is that this is a toxic industry that relies on desperation and manipulation. So would you mind going a little bit further into that, and what did you notice about Devilcorp where it specifically relied on desperation and manipulation?
I can perfectly just start off where with like me applying to the business and whatnot because when I applied to the business, I was like really down my luck trying to find work and whatnot, right? I came out of college in like May 2023. I applied to this job in early September and I got it and started 2 weeks later. But I went to this job because, I was kept applying to like all these dozens and dozens of jobs. I wasn't getting anything. And the one job that gave me a job interview like rejected me. So eventually I needed something. And then, when this company called my office, not called my office, called me,
Yeah.
and then they were like, we would love to schedule a second for an interview. And then 2 rounds of interview, I got the job. I was ecstatic. And there's a lot of people that were also in my shoes in that office where they were like either like recently out of college or like, they didn't really have a college education, didn't really know what to do with their careers and whatnot. So yeah, just like relying on stuff like that, for example. And then, the whole manipulation tactics, like I remember in my first week there, because they do what in my office, they do what's called an orientation week, where they explain the whole structure of the business and then eventually to get you set ready to sell in stores and whatnot. I was selling in Costco in particular. But they explain like the whole structure of the business, and then and then they kind of like rip the rug underneath out from you, and then you kind of realize you're going to be like a sales rep selling smartphones and a Costco and whatnot. I guess like that can be kind of like considered manipulation in that sense because you're going from, in my second round interview, they weren't like necessarily like blatantly lying about like the job, but they heavily downplayed the sales part. Like they made it seem like, oh yeah, like we do some like on-site event promotions, but like they made it seem like it was a really small part of the business. And then when I got to the office and started like actually going to stores and whatnot, I realized that's just the entirety of the business besides the morning meetings and whatnot. And then when I was in my orientation week, they were really trying to sell the job opportunity first rather than telling me about the job. Like the first couple of days of orientation, it was just explaining the whole structure of the business, like how far you can advance the business, like up to like regional and national consultant and whatnot, like what you need to do, the opportunity, the money. They kept saying over and over and over again that like my owner was like making set to make like $800,000 this year, which was problematic, but we'll get to that later. And then they kept doing that, and then like on like day 3 of orientation, that's when they started teaching me how to like sell smartphones at Costco, and then that's when I kind of realized like, oh, maybe this job isn't so much what it is. But again, like since they rely on desperation, I just really wanted a job at the time, so I was like, okay, I'll stick it out for now, right?
I mean, I get it. You are done with school, you need something. Life isn't free, especially now, and you got to pay stuff. So yeah, I can understand that, especially if you aren't getting any other bites from any other jobs. Now, in this message, you broke down the orientation week, and what you just talked about the structure of the company, which I found it interesting that it felt like they were more selling the opportunity to you instead of telling you exactly what your day-to-day job is going to be. But
Yeah.
that's a huge red flag, and that should tell anybody if you go into one of these interviews, if they're not telling you what you're going to be doing every single day, but they're more focusing on what you could be doing months, years down the line, get out, because that's exactly what one of these companies does. But you use the term ICD, and I've only heard something similar to that when I've spoken with former Sidcor reps, ICL. So can you tell us what they told you ICD was?
ICD was essentially like just like your own status of ownership. So going back to that Costco like leaders board for a moment earlier, they were essentially ranking all the like ICDs, aka owners, in that business. So like mine would usually be like second to eighth, but there's like a little top of the paragraph. I still actually have a saved photo on my phone, but there's a little in the top right. It would say some like number of ICDs, and it was like 120. Like I think ICD in this business was just like your status of ownership, or at least like some sort of like license for you to like sell the products in. But so yeah, but I think that's a term they're kind of like throwing around now because owner, I guess, sounds a little like demeaning to some people. So you have like ICD that like kind of sounded like more formal and like kind of prop up the business a little bit more.
Yeah, it sounds official. It sounds legal, even though it's completely made up by Smart Circle. It doesn't make it. It has literally no meaning to it. So you were standing at Costco all day selling, I think you said AT&T and then iPhones, different phones and stuff like that. So tell me about the Costco environment, because I only, when I was with Smart Circle, I was strictly Sam's Club, but I know the two stores are exactly the same, even though they kind of have their own subcultures. So what was the Costco environment like, having to spend all day like just approaching people, getting shot down, and that whole environment?
Yeah, definitely a little uncomfortable at times. Now we're largely dealing with like older customers. So like,
Yeah.
they would usually probably be like a little bit nicer than like, maybe like a younger customer because they would be like a little bit more formal, I guess. But even then, like that made it a little bit more difficult to sell phones because older people are just not as interested in upgrading their smartphones as much as like younger people are. And then, I felt like they kept emphasizing like don't be pushy, don't be pushy. But day one when I was in the field, I was with my owner. He usually goes to the field like once or two times a week, and then he usually goes when he's like helping to try to train renew reps. And I was essentially shadowing him. For viewers who don't know what shadowing means, it just basically means like stand by his side and just watch what he does for like the first day. And they kept like saying the whole morning, that morning, mean like don't be pushy, don't be pushy, be compliant. But my owner was so pushy with the customers, and like he essentially just would not let them go. He would not give them like a chance to like breathe, like when he was talking to them. Like he was just so aggressive, so assertive. And then I saw that mentality a lot from like the other top leaders, like just like going into the business. And then they kind of just like threw me out there, right? Like I didn't really like practice much of like my sales pitch and whatnot. Like they're just like by day two they're like, okay, do it on your own. And I'm like, you haven't even like taught me like the ins and outs, like the four systems, right? I at best know like five steps. So yeah, it was definitely uncomfortable at times, especially because like I'm from New York, and like it's a very densely populated area, so we get like tons of foot traffic, and having to like practice pitch at like thousands of customers a day and just get like tons of no's. The no's didn't wear like heavy on me, at least initially, but like yeah, it was definitely like an uncomfortable feeling, especially when like trying to sell stuff. One other thing I mentioned in that email was AT&T is not very popular in New York. It's more popular in like others in like more southern states like California, Texas, and Florida and whatnot. Like Verizon and T-Mobile are dominant here, so it's just kind of like trying to get people like switch to AT&T. It was just kind of like you're kind of like just forcing them to do something they really do not want, right? And it was uncomfortable at first, definitely.
So you mentioned a little bit about red flags in this message, but you also said right after that that you found excuses to justify it. So whatever complaints people had, like you said, standing in a Costco for 6 to 8 hours a day, or driving an hour a day round trip and not getting paid for it. Which, if I mean, technically what you're describing is a sense of brainwashing, because you
Yeah.
have to go to these morning meetings and they condition you to think in certain ways. They condition you to respond to people or respond to doubts in certain ways. So, and again, you were just there for a very short amount of time. And I think this really stresses to anyone watching this video how quickly the manipulation tactics happen. I mean, the job ad, that's when it starts technically, and how quickly the brainwashing happens, because you were only there for 3 months, but even within that short amount of time, you were able to push away the red flags. You were able to make excuses for them. So what were some, I'm always curious, what were some of those excuses that you told yourself in justifying the things you were being told to do?
I think it ultimately ties back to like the whole like, hard work equals more success mentality. Cause like, like the more you're in Costco, the more hours you have, like the more likely you're able to get sales. And then the more sales you get, the further you can go in the business and whatnot. And like the more you're willing to drive, the more you're willing to sacrifice. Sacrifice. I heard that word a lot. Like the more reward you can get. But I really just did not see it in this business really, where I did. And then but they just kept drilling into my head to where eventually like I was like just kept like thinking that. Like I mentioned some of the excuse in my emails and, like driving hours and hours a day. Like I was like, okay, I'm not like crazy about this business, but I could probably get promoted to like leadership and management. And even if I don't stick out with the business forever, like that will look good on my resume. And hey, maybe if I become really good at selling sales, I could become my own owner one day and then, generate all this like unfathomable money, they would say. And
Mhm.
they would always drill in again, my owner's supposed net worth where of like $800,000 a year. And they would always like the way they would show this was by flexing like his at least he would flex his American Airlines points, where he would have like this unfathomable amount of American Airlines points, and then he would be like, "Oh yeah, like this is what I get from like this business and whatnot." But as we learn later on, it's problematic because he would accumulate all those points from like his business trips and whatnot that he would send out reps to like other offices, particularly anyone who's worked with Smart Circle knows who Kinsey and Jess V are.
Yep.
Definitely send out a lot of road trips there. Um, and then you realize like, oh wait, later on, that was just all the money he would get out of his business account because, you know, and then Smart Circle would just let him just kind of like get away with that. So they were a lot of like hard work mentality or like be like your owner, be like your owner. Then that just kind of got driven to my brain after a while because he was always like organized and like on time and energetic in the morning. It was kind of just like, you know what, why not be like him, right?
Mhm.
He made it, why can't I?
Yeah. And you talked about the narrative that your owner was making 800 or was on track to make $800,000 a year. When did you start to see? I know you mentioned the airline points, which I mean, if you're going to use airline points as a measure of
Yeah.
wealth, that's pretty pathetic. But when did you start to realize that maybe this person is not what they seem?
So just a quick disclaimer about my owner. I think he's a pretty nice guy for the most part. He's just fully indoctrinated, like the brainwashing and whatnot. He's
Okay.
not like the other market manager I mentioned in that email, but I'll talk about him later where he acted like a cartoon villain, but I'll save that for later.
Okay.
Um yeah, with him, it was definitely like he would just it was a lot like I'm trying to find the best way to describe this. But with him, it was just all about like the business and whatnot. Like, he would say like all this, he had like all this money, and then the employees around would say how all this money. But I started to realize when he was not what it seems, when I just started like kind of piecing together, like he has like no social life outside of this business, right? Like he would never talk about like his friends. His girlfriend was our admin and she was a former failed owner herself. So like, pretty much all his friends and his love life was like into the business. So it was just all that. What really caught my eye was like sometime in early November where he would say something. I think he was going to go to like a Knicks game that day with like one of the other top leaders, but he eventually called off and then was like, oh yeah, because one of the other top leaders that day called out sick, and he was like, you know what, we can go to a Knicks game, but let's be like, let's do the right thing and like go into the store and sell stuff because we had need to fill in for our leader and whatnot. And I thought that was just that kind of like rubbed me the wrong way because I realized that, and I was just kind of like, no, you should want to have a little bit of free time, like. Just put like one of the other reps that weren't scheduled on that day in the field. Like it was just a lot like that. And then what I did not mention in my original email was that on my first week there, he actually promoted someone out to the Fred Meyers phone campaign, which I think you've heard like a whole bunch of issues with that, right?
Mhm.
He promotes someone out, and then he would always tell stories about how like, oh yeah, like he used to beg me like to work 7 days a week, and then after a while, I was just thinking like that's like really dystopian. You should not like want to like beg to work 7 hours a week, long shifts, like until like 8:30 at night in Costco, right?
Mhm.
So just a lot of like me realizing he had like no real like social life, like kind of like outside the business, and then in the business, what he would do. Part of the reason why his office was so successful was because if we go back to the Slave Circle documentary, when you were interviewing Matt, he mentioned how, like, you know, a lot of the owners that would actually get somewhere in his business would basically be the ones that would kind of just, like, you know, stuck up to the higher ups and then, you know, kind of like finagle their way there. He was definitely one of them. Like, he would constantly just, like, you know, every single day do whatever, like, you know, his regional, his national, aka Kinsey and Jess, like anything they wanted. And he was in big cahoots with Zach Shook, and then a whole bunch of other like nationals. Dwayne Long, I think you're aware. I don't
Mhm.
know if you're aware of him because I think he came into the business like right after you quit. But anyone who's worked in Smart Circle recently know who's Demar is. Um, but yeah, he would just do a lot of that, which is why he would kind of get away with like some other stuff that like other owners wanted. So it kind of became a little apparent, especially after I quit, when I kind of like put two and two together. After I like, you know, there's a reason why he like this office was the way it was, right? And I kind of realized like there was an element of like fakeness to that, both in the business and out of the business in terms of like just social life and connections, definitely.
What was the everyday pay like for a rep?
Everyday pay. All right, so we're gonna fast forward a little bit. So when I came to the business, they said it was 15 an hour, which is like the minimum wage in New York State right now. 15 an hour base pay for every hour you work. And then it's 75 in commission for every phone line you sell. So let's say hypothetically, I'll do a little math on my phone right now. Let's say you sell 5 lines in one day and then work like 8 hours. You would make $495 that day. And you know, they would kind of sell that. They could be like, yo, you can make that money like just now, right?
Mhm.
Here's the problems with that. Um, number one, that's before taxes. Number two, um, they never told me what the exact details of the pay and the commission were. So in the AT&T campaign, they would talk about the different plans you can sell. In
Mhm.
Costco, you can sell 3 different AT&T plans, aka starter, extra, and premium. Each plan was about like $5 to $10 worth more than the next. Then, you know, they say it was all $75 per line, but that's actually not true. If you sold starter, you would get $10 less in commission compared to if you sold premium and extra. Additionally, they would sell another feature called Next Up. Next Up was a feature that would like let you upgrade your smartphone after like 18 months, but it was additional
Mhm.
like $6 out to your phone line. If you did not put Next Up on their order, that was another $10 off. So if
Hmm.
you sold 5 lines of starter, no Next Up, you would be making 275 in commission rather than 375. But that gets even more problematic when you realize, and this was never explained. I learned this 1 week before I quit. They would actually only give you commission or the base pay depending on what was higher. So let's say if I worked like 30 hours and only sold 2 lines, I would get that like 30 hours, right? And then if I like only worked 10 hours and then I sold like 7 lines, I would just get the 7 lines. They never explained this to me. They never said that was a cutoff. I found that out 1 week before just by some like other disgruntled rep who wanted to quit too. And then I was just like, they lied to me about that. I mean, I'm not surprised now because it's Devilcorp, obviously, but like, yeah, like, so there really wasn't much of a difference between, you know, like selling like 11 lines and like 11 lines working a lot of hours and 4 lines working a lot of hours, even though they definitely advertised the position. Like, I think the largest paycheck I got there was like $400 a week, which really it's not getting you far in New York, especially nowadays. Like, a lot of my paychecks were between like 200 and 450 because sometimes they weren't scheduling me a lot of hours if I like got there wasn't selling well that week. So yeah, the pay was definitely problematic. It was always an overstatement what they say. You really would only see money come in if you were like, you know, selling over 15 lines a week. Then you would probably see like a little bit of money trickle in. But again, it wasn't a lot. What really caught my eye when I was in business about halfway there was my owner. not my owner, actually, my team leader, he was complaining about the amount of money he was generating. He was like, oh, my direct deposit's gonna be so bad this week. And I'm like, how? You just sold like 14 lines last week. That's like decent, right? But he was like, this is gonna be so bad. And then, as for the reasons mentioned earlier, like, he doesn't get the base pay. And then what's also problematic is you only get your commission when the customer activates his phone lines. They don't tell you that. They tell you you get the commission when you just make the sale. So you can be waiting up to like a month for some of these customers to activate their phone lines, and then that's when you finally get paid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, when you add in like taxes and whatnot, you're really not bringing a lot of money at the end of the day. So yeah, just a whole lot of problems with that like were never like completely glossed over in order to like get people into the business and whatnot. And then by the time you like actually do learn about that, like the whole sunk cost fallacy comes in, and then you're just kind of like, I'm already here, like whatever, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think the vast majority of people that stay longer than a week in any of these companies share the same rationale. Why? Because of the sunk cost fallacy. They may notice some little things, but they're like, well, I'm already here. Well, got to find another job if I leave, so might as well just stick it out. So it's not surprising that there is rampant sexism in Devilcorp, and you talk about this as well. And you make a very interesting stipulation between the Costco campaign and the BJ's campaign. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, what you noticed and why there is this, at least in your office, this sexism.
First, I just want to clarify to like the audience. So in my office, I mentioned this earlier, but I want to explain further. There are two market managers in my office. One runs a Costco campaign. He was my owner, and then one runs four BJ's and then one Sam's Club as well. He was also in the office. The owner that ran the BJ's campaign was he was like in the retraining program for a while, but according to what they at least told me, he graduated, but they still stuck in the same office because one, rent in New York is expensive, like might as well share it to like lower the cost. And two, like him and my owner got along. So they were kind of just like, why not? We can like, beat off each other, like help improve our teams the same way, right? So yeah, I also want to preface this with me allegedly. This is allegedly
Yeah.
me saying this, right?
But
can't
I
like
think you're onto something, and that's why I really like you to talk about it, because the way you describe it, especially with the difference between the stores, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So how I did my first round interview, it was not my owner, it was the other owner who did that. And I think that's important to mention. So the gender ratio on the Costco side was about like 75-25 in favor of the guys. But on the BJ side, it was about 50-50, maybe even like 45-55, like in favor of the woman, right? So that's important because in BJ's, the compliance is lower. You can like get away in Costco. We couldn't do stuff like be extra pushy with the customers. The first no we got, we had to let them go. In BJ's, you're allowed to be like, oh, come on, like, why not buy my phones? You're allowed to be a little bit more pushy. What you're also allowed to do in BJ's is that you're allowed to give out your phone number as quote unquote like a business number in case like the customer wants to come back and he's like wants to do the order at like a later time. And I think that's like important to uh put two and two together here, because I know like I'm not 100% sure how it works with the first round interviews, but my owner and the other owner would kind of like do each other's interviews sometimes. And I kind of like just by putting two and two together, did they put more women on the BJ side because they're allowed to give out their numbers, to where like pervert customers can just come in and be like, I don't really want to buy AT&T, but hey, like there's this like good looking woman over here, like I want her number, right? So yeah, again, it's allegedly this happens, but like that's definitely something I noticed where I was just like, I don't think it's a coincidence, right, that this is going on.
Yeah, especially I mean, as a guy, I'll be honest, females can be very persuasive. And if I'm going to get a random female give me her personal number for a business transaction, I might read a little bit into that. So yeah, I think that makes total sense as to why on the campaign where you can be a little pushier, you can maybe get away with things that Costco won't let you get away with for compliance, that you're going to have those types of things. So I think that's a very valid way of looking at it. Now you brought up a couple names before, Jessica and Kinsey. Anyone who's been watching these videos knows them. Another very infamous person, Mike T, who you mentioned as
Oh
well.
yeah.
He's so infamous, he only goes by Mike T. But you were subjected to a weekly conference call by the infamous Mike T. So can you tell us a little bit about that call and what were some of the things? I mean, we know anyone who's been in Devilcorp knows that it's the morning meetings, but then there's also these indoctrinating conference calls that you have to be on. So tell us a little bit about that Mike T call.
Yeah, so every Thursday at 9 a.m., it would be a Mike T conference call, and pretty much all the offices that relate to the AT&T campaign, whether it be Costco, BJ, Sam's, Fred Meyer's, now they're trying to get into Target, Walmart, which still has a couple offices remaining. Like they would go hop on call, and then Mike T would rant about for like 30 minutes about like compliance and whatnot. And he would just kind of like rant and like in like a very aggressive manner. And then I mentioned in my email this one experience where I jokingly said Mike T looks like Big Brother from like George Orwell's 1984 because like he he literally the way he would like position, he was like positioned so close to the camera too, where it like literally looked like he was watching. So like I just kept getting that like vibe. I would make that joke a couple of times, but one time I did. One of the other reps like berated me for it. He was like, "Yo, like shut up, like be grateful that Mike T gave you this opportunity to begin with." And I just found that extremely cultish. And then this rep like quit like a week later too, and it was just like I don't know what happened there, but yeah, I like. And then people like the effects of brainwashing were also present there. Then like he would always like rant on and on and on about compliance and whatnot. That's pretty much all the conference calls were just like compliance. And then he would always talk about like how the growth of business. He was like, "Oh, we're going to be in like 100% of Costco's by like the end of 2024 and whatnot." When in reality, like I learned some of this like after I left the business. Like the growth is like you know not really necessarily there, right?
Yeah.
So one other person in my office was set to get promoted out by the time I left, but he wasn't. Even though he was like supposed to get promoted out by like the end of December, right before I left, I heard like he wasn't going to get promoted out until like late March because there were just like a lack of offices that like just
Mhm.
open, and I'm not even 100% sure if he's gotten promoted out yet. So like that told me like the amount of offices that they always say they need people running is not really there. And then like I think I saw this on Reddit, and I'm not entirely sure how like valid this is, but I heard recently like I think like Alphalet Marketing, which is owned by the Hidalgo brothers, which is another person like my owner would constantly like
Yeah,
use
they're
as an example.
notorious. Yeah.
Yeah, like use an example like Prop and whatnot. I think recently they got kicked out of Costco or some other like big box store, and then now they have to like do door to door and whatnot for at least one of their campaigns. It might have been AT&T. So like the growth is not really there because a lot of these stores A do not want us there, and B there's not a lot of offices open. But he would always just emphasize the fact like over and over and over again, like just like the business is growing so much and we
Mhm.
need more people. And then after that, another executive would get on. I'm not too sure if he was affiliated with Smart Circle or Costco in general. His name was McCall Goodman. Um, he would then after that shout like all the nationwide high rollers from like the high week, and then there were some people who were making like allegedly like $3,000-4,000, but A, this was before tax, and B, I really would not be surprised if they manipulated like the money because I never saw any crazy paychecks coming to like either me or any of the other top reps in my office, right?
Mhm.
So I can't verify that for certain, but that's what they would do. And then, they like would give like shouts on national conference call. And then, to a lot of like top leaders who were selling well, I assume this would just be like, very motivating because imagine getting shout outs from like, one of the head honchos of this program.
Sure.
again on a conference call with like thousands of people on it, right? Like, again, it's the whole fame part of like the 4 F's, like that I think they really were trying to emphasize in those conference calls.
Most of the people that I talk to experience a flip of the switch moment, a moment where something happens where you either realize what you've gotten yourself into or you start to think a little differently about things. And you had a similar moment where you talk about, I think this was in December when your heat went out, and you were in, like, it was just a series of events, and we all have those days, right, where all these things happen to us, things pile on. But that conversation with your owner was very enlightening to you, and you started to, I think the facade started to crumble, if I'm correct there, after you had that conversation.
Yeah, the facade definitely started to crumble there. It was already like cracked, I would say, but that's
Yeah.
when it really that's when it like really was like, okay, what's really going on here, right? So I'll explain to the audience just for like a full story. That morning, it was like a Thursday, like obviously New York in December, it's freezing. And then my heat went out of my house, and then I was already kind of like not having a great week because I was like just rolling donuts in the field. I had no sales that week, and then that happened. So I woke up absolutely freezing cold. I had to take a cold shower, which not fun, but and then, I get into the office and then they're not even scheduling me for the rest of the week because of low sales. But then my owner was like, oh, yeah, just take the rest of the week off. Like, you could use a mental break. And, I was just kind of like ranting to him about the situation. Like, I did mention earlier, he's like mostly a nice guy. So, like,
Mhm.
he was like at least sympathetic. But something caught my eye that I didn't think of much initially, but I was thinking a lot of when I was on the car ride home from morning meeting that day, where he said something like, "Oh, I totally understand like your situation. Like sometimes my landlord's too cheap to even turn the heat on," and I was like, "What?" And I was like, "You have a net worth of supposedly $800,000, and you live in an apartment where your landlord is too cheap to even turn on the heat sometimes." And I was just kind of like, "That does not add up, at least." Um, I was like, you have all this money. Living in New York is not cheap. Like, don't get me wrong, but like, I was just like, you don't have like anything better. Like, I just, I didn't get it. I was just kind of like, okay, so, and then it like really made me question. I was like, okay, where's the money really going, right? And then obviously when I got out of the business, I learned the whole like business account thing where it's like, oh, it's not actually your money, it's all Smart Circle's money. And but again, since my owner was able to just um suck up to the higher ups a lot, like was able to use some of his business money for like all the like the trips I mentioned earlier.
Yep.
So like that's why he only would flex his like wealth through like American Airlines points, because that's really what he was only allowed to like spend it on, right? But in
Mhm.
reality, like I looked at his car. It was like, it wasn't anything special. Like he had like an older phone, and like he would always talk about like, I'm gonna retire my parents, I'm gonna retire my parents and whatnot. And I'm like, you have $800,000, like, and then he's like, yeah, I'm like 5-10 years away. I'm like, if you have $800,000, you should be like feel like closer to your goal. Maybe I'm looking too deep into that, but like, yeah, just like a lot of like circumstantial evidence. Like he would like flaunt wealth, but it didn't really necessarily show. And then that was kind of like my awakening moment where I was just like, something's really wrong, right?
Sure. They flaunt things that don't exist yet. They flaunt future wealth. And going back to what you said very early on in this interview, was they were trying to sell you the opportunity more so than the day to day. So that's a constant theme. If that's the theme at the beginning of your Devilcorp career, it's going to be a continuous theme. So these owners, and we've heard in all of these videos, these owners are not making any money. Some of them are making $15,000 a year. They're netting under 20,000, which is below the poverty line. But they're being advertised six figures. But they think in their minds, no, future wealth, future wealth. It'll happen. It'll happen. I just need to keep going. But it's never going to happen. So yeah, they can only flaunt it to a certain extent. And I don't think you're reading too much into that at all, because I've heard from many other people who've said a goal that they're owner has told them was to retire their parents, or some have supposedly already retired their parents. But yeah, I would think if you're going to pull down $800,000 in a single year, you can afford to retire your parents and maybe even a couple other people too. Because if that's a yearly thing, how much money do your parents need to live on? I mean, you could give them half of that, and that's a pretty good retirement account, you know?
Right.
So, I mean, no, you're not reading too much into that. That's just another red flag. And it's interesting how you noticed you started picking apart things that were being said. And that's really important too, is just listen. The truth does start to come out in instances where it's not meant to come out. Like you said, he was kind of sympathizing with you being human, which again, you know, that's something rare. We really don't hear a lot about that. But he's sympathizing with you, but then the truth comes out about his living situation. The truth comes out about one of his life goals, which he has not accomplished yet, even though he's supposedly making $800,000. So yeah, the pieces don't fit together. And how you left Smart Circle was kind of interesting, because you just mentioned about how you were having a bad day and all that with the heat and everything. You've been rolling donuts, but then you actually had a really good day in the field.
Yeah.
But that ended up leading to the end of your time at Smart Circle anyway.
Yeah, it was kind of hilarious how it played out. So like I didn't work for the rest of that week, and then I was scheduled in the field that Monday, and I had a pretty good day in the field. I sold 5 lines, that's pretty good.
That's a good day. Yeah.
Yeah, with next up and extra, so I got the full commission. I was like, okay, yeah, made some good money today. I go home and I was like briefly like reinvigorated, I guess you could say, about the business. So I was just kind of like looking some stuff up online. I was like trying to find like names and whatnot. I didn't really like encounter like any like anti-Devilcorp resources like these at the time. The only thing I found was just like on Google Images, like Mike T's image with like the Devilcorp horns on it.
Mhm.
But I didn't really think much of it. I just thought it was kind of hilarious to look at. But I was going online, and then I stumbled across, I think it was Zach Schutz, with his, I think, acquire marketing, if I'm correct. I like looked at acquire marketing, and then on Google, it was like a 2.3 out of 5 stars in reviews with like 400 people reviewing. And I was just like, what? And then that really caught my eye. I was like, okay. And then I look up like I think the Hidalgo brothers, and then they were hardly any better. They were like 2.4. And then on Glassdoor, Zach Shook was like 1.9 out of 5 stars, which and then it led me to the Devilcorp WordPress, that like long article, which I also found really hilarious to work to like read, because it was just like, oh, that makes sense. And then it was kind of like, oh, that's actually like really hilarious. And then like it led me to like eventually your video, which I was at home at the time, so I was just kind of like, I was like, why not give it a watch? And I found it like just like kind of like captivating in that sense, like just this whole like business is even like to able to like operate and exist. And I guess it ties back to your whole question of when you asked earlier, when you said like, why do you keep coming back to this? It just really because like I guess I'm also fascinated with the fact that like such an operation can like exist and like has existed for so long. It's like
Yeah.
finds all these legal loopholes. But I digress. When I come back, when I'm done watching the video, at first I felt like, a little bit of like, that sort of like heart sinking feeling of like, you wasting time in this office. But it wasn't as bad for like other people. So obviously, I was only there for 3 months. But,
Mhm.
there was like a like brief bit of like me kind of being like a little angry at myself for like, wasting time. But after that, but like that was brief. And then after that, I was like, okay, like I'm convinced, like I need to get out of here, because I already knew something was up, and then
Mhm.
that just kind of completely reaffirmed it. And then, but I didn't want to quit immediately. And then my mom at the time was like, you shouldn't quit immediately, because like there's not a lot of jobs open right now, which
Yeah.
is kind of true. It took me 2 months to get another job after I left, but. So I tried sticking it out for a little bit, but I found it really difficult to do that. Because I just after I watched like all these like your video and all these resources, I just felt like so guilty for like just basically harassing Costco customers for like 3 months, right? And then I come like that first day in the field, I was also scheduled like right out in the field like after that day, and then like I found it so hard to like pitch customers. Like at certain points, I would just take like long breaks in the break room that day, and I was just like, I'm going to waste as much time not pitching customers. I'm one of those people who are like, you can't force me to do things I just don't want to do. And when I really do not want to pitch like customers and like bother them all day, I'm just like, I'm checked out, right? So it was a lot of that. And then I still was there for like 2 more weeks, but like I was just like half-assing it for lack of better words.
Mhm.
Where I was just kind of like, if I was working alone, I literally would not pitch anyone. I would just stand there on like the little iPad they give us, and I was just kind of like scrolling through social media apps and whatnot. And then if someone was there, I'd be like in the back of like the AT&T kiosk we were pitching at, and I would just kind of like fake pitch and whatnot, just
Mhm.
like hope they don't like notice me not doing my job and whatnot. And then what's also kind of hilarious is that my leader, who by the way, I don't want to get like too deep into this because I feel like this could happen to anyone. It's not necessarily unique, but my leader was like really terrible at his job. And then, he would constantly ignore my text. So I was like, yo, can we do a breakdown call? Never would text me back, ghost me all the time. He never really did a good job teaching people. And then I do want to touch base on this afterwards, the office standards when it comes to promotion, because I did mention that in my original email, but we'll get to that later.
Sure.
Um, like overall, just not a good leader. And then he calls me in the middle of this 2 weeks, and he's like, yo, like I've been such a bad leader to you. I'm sorry. He was like, it was like a plea to help or something like that. Like, I guess you could say he was kind of like, just like, please, like, he kind of sounded like he wanted me to stay on the business, even though he had like no idea that like I already discovered all this stuff.
Mhm.
He was like, if you get like 10 lines this week, I'll promote you instantly or something like that. And then, but at that point, I didn't care about getting promoted to leadership. I just want to get out of there, right?
Mhm.
So that goes on for 2 weeks. I roll both weeks, but I don't care, right? At that point, and then like right before New Year's, I noticed I get kicked out of like all my work apps and whatnot. So I was like, okay, I know what's coming next, right?
Mhm.
And then I just text my leader like, what's going on? Like act like fake pretended, I guess. I was like, what's going on? And he's like, I'll call you right now. And then he calls me, and then he gives me like this 10 minute like spiel about how like you're such a great employee, like you've worked so hard, but take like 2 to 3 weeks off. Like we need like because you're not selling well, but like we really need you. And then after that call, I never heard from them again. That was just kind of their way of like that was like their nice way of just like kind of letting me go.
Sure.
But at that point, I just didn't care. I was like, okay, like I actually have an excuse, and then like just get out of this business, right?
You had mentioned a little bit about, how your mom didn't want you to quit right away, and fair enough because of the job market. Did she or anyone else in your circle express any concern about this job or notice any change in yourself during that time or anything like that?
Not so much with like my mom. They kind of like, I would like there were some things that like, the job would do that like, on paper would seem like good habits, like not sleeping into the morning each day and whatnot. Like, you know, working hard and whatnot. Like they never my parents never really like expressed concerns about that, but my friends definitely noticed a change in my behavior. That's the one uh where it definitely was prevalent where there were like times in Smart Circle where since I was like working so many hours, I didn't see a lot of my friends for like, 3, 4 weeks straight, right?
Yeah.
And then like, I didn't even have like a lot of time to like either call them or like see them in person. And then, you know, I described like the business opportunity to them, and then even they were like a little sketched out. Like after I left, and then I told them all about this, they were like, "Oh, you know what? It did sound kind of sketchy to begin with, right?" And then they noticed I was like a little too like hyper focused on the business. Like they didn't really see me. They definitely said like I was like less of a presence and like they're socialized compared to
Yeah.
like prior because it's just that whole like dehumanization thing, right? And then
Yeah.
something I also want to touch on the dehumanization thing, like this is not necessarily related, but when I was in the field, like later in the field, like late November and whatnot, my leader would usually complain about how I was sounding like so robotic when I was in the field. Which I found that like so like I was like, wait, how are you? How? I was like confused. I was like, I sound robotic. Like I'm normally very animated when I talk. I was like, you saying I sound like a robot, but after I go went out of the business again, I kind of put two together. I was like so like just following the scripts to an absolute T that I was starting to sound like a robot, right?
Hmm.
So again, that whole like dehumanization thing where it was just like it was affecting the way of like how I talked and like how I like my whole social relationships and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, you do become a different person, right? I mean, if your only or your only way of thinking is the systems and you say the same thing hundreds of times a day, I mean, that's conditioning your brain to just be that. And that's it. And that's what they rely on. That's also why they isolate you from your friends and from your social circle. They make you work 80, 90 hours a week and drive 2 hours a day and team nights and crew nights and networking events and breakfasts and all this other stuff so that you don't have time for anyone else. So before I go to my next question, you had mentioned, and I think I remember reading this in your email too, about, like you said, the office standards for promotion. Um, so there's all these levels, and they differ depending on if you're Smart Circle, Sidcore, or Credico slightly, but they're basically the same thing. What did you notice about your office's standards for promotion?
Uh, long, very simply, like just inconsistent. Now to go deep into that, so how my office's promotions worked, it probably varied a little bit by office, but in order to get promoted to leadership, you need to accrue uh 10 lines of back-to-back weeks, do all your teach backs and a couple other like breakdown stuff, right?
Mhm.
So in my case, my there was one week, I'm not too sure if I mentioned this in my original email, but there was 2 weeks where I got 12 lines one week, and then I got 8 lines the next week, which is 20. But my leader wouldn't promote me. He's like, nope, you need to get double digits. You need to get double digits both weeks. And I was just kind of like, okay. But then they promote someone else um who like got like 7 and 15, and but he got promoted, and I was just like, why am I not getting promoted? Like my leader had like really like high standards for like getting promoted. Like you had to do everything to a T. But for some of the other leaders in the office, it was just like do your teach backs and just get like 20 lines at 2 weeks. It was just as simple as that. But like yeah, there was like no rhyme or consistency with that. And then like, I actually complained to my owner about that. I was like, how come I didn't get promoted for like selling 12 lines and then 8 lines and then doing 20, but he did? And then my owner was like, listen, I get it, but like there's ultimately nothing I could do. Like he has the power as team leader. I'm like, but you're an owner. I didn't say it to his face, but I was just like,
Yeah.
you're an owner. You should have like that authority. And it was just kind of like it didn't like really exist. And then going back to the whole inconsistency, like I feel like with the AT&T campaign, there's luck involved when it comes to sales, but I feel like
Oh,
with the
sure.
AT&T campaign, like too much of it was luck. Like there's just too many like days where it was like some like you had to pitch everyone, but like sometimes you would get like 6 lines and sometimes you get like 1 line, right? It wasn't like, everyone was buying like one product or something like that. Like, depending on who you talk to, you get like a bunch of lines, right? Yeses in the AT&T campaign are like the number of sales you did. I thought it would probably be better to like measure it on the like the yeses, like the amount of sales, not the lines, because again, like you can be talking to like you can get like 7 yeses but like 9 lines, and then you can get like 3 yeses and then like 15 lines or something like that, right? But they would measure the again the promotion standards were just based on lines, and it was just like you know looking back on it, it was just like it's just a flawed methodology. But
Mhm.
hey, like I guess the AT&T campaign wanted to do it like that, so that's how they ran it.
You said you didn't even realize this was a Smart Circle offer. You didn't know what Smart Circle was until after you quit. Um, and that was really based on a question you asked about who the big company was, right? Who the parent company was. Because like you said in your message, if you're going to have these executives like Mike T and all these big shots, I mean, they didn't all come from this singular marketing company. There has to be someone overseeing this. Otherwise, who are these hundreds of people on these conference calls? When you go
Yeah.
to Dallas and when you go to these quarterly conferences, who are these hundreds of other people? They didn't all come from this office, so there has to be some type of external structure. So how did you find out about who Smart Circle was?
Yeah, so I kept questioning like who the parent company was the whole time because I was obvious like there's gotta be like some sort of hierarchy, right? I kind of like stupidly thought it was like EDM at first because the official AT&T campaign is called AT&T EDM, so I thought the company was like named EDM or something like that. Then we had something called a DSI rep come into our office who were like secret shop like customers, which by the way is just brazenly authoritarian in a way, like just like spying on us, like making sure we're doing our jobs and whatnot. Um, yeah, so I thought it was something like called like DSI or something like that. And then I know there's a company once called DS Max or something like that. So I
Yeah,
kind of
DS
thought like,
Max.
yeah. So I kind of thought it was that, but then, you know, the way I found out was like I was just watching like your interviews really, and then like, but like I think it was like one of the old ones. It was like one of the owners, and then her interview was like ranting about Kinsey for like 10 minutes. And I was like, and then like on the caption it said Smart Circle. And so I was like, okay, you know what? This is smart. It's gotta be Smart Circle, right? But I find that like so hilarious, like that just the amount of like information control they did. Now I never went on like any of the big trips like Dallas or like any of the regional conferences. I probably would have learned about that if I did. But like yeah, like they did a very good job to say the least of keeping that hidden. Like no one mentioned it in the office. No, never like a word out of it from like my leader or whatnot. Like they would always just address it as this business, this opportunity, right? Very just like hush hush about it. Also,
Yeah.
side note, this is getting a little sidetracked, but I want to mention this. They were like really culty about the Dallas meeting in the office. Like, so in each morning meeting, we have our like a little announcements section where they kind of like do like, upcoming events and whatnot. Now,
Mhm.
Dallas happened like 2 weeks after I got hired, but um, even after Dallas, they would be like, oh yeah, Dallas is upcoming. I'm like, dude, like Dallas is like 11 months away. Like, why is this in the announcements? But then what they would also do is that they would have someone who went to Dallas comes up and then he would like recite like the same word by word paragraph every single day where he's like, yo, Dallas was so awesome. It was like the opportunity of my lifetime. And it was just like the way they kept selling Dallas over and over and over again every single day, even though it was like 11 months away, like that felt a little like culty, definitely. Like just the way they were kind of just like, like it was like, oh, this is so great. Like I don't need to hear nonstop about how great Dallas supposedly is, right?
Yeah, it's not great. It's you have no time to do anything. You literally are bussed from the airport to the hotel. You are expected to network nonstop. The good thing is they feed you. I mean, they feed you really well. Three course or 3 meals a day. You don't pay for anything, and it's good food. But you have to network. You have to be nonstop networking. You're going to these meetings, these trainings. They're essentially brainwashing functions, all of them. It's an entire brainwashing weekend. But I mean, they send you, right. They send you to this new environment. You're surrounded by thousands of hungry, excited, kind of confused, kind of unsure people, and you're the same way, and you're kind of feeding off of that energy. There is this like mob mentality. If you see
Oh yeah.
Zach Schutz walking around or Kinsey, everybody's like, oh, I gotta go talk to Kinsey, or I gotta go talk to Larissa or whoever. These fake business idols who know, but outside of this business, nobody knows who these people are. Like if you contact people at any legitimate business publication or business website and you bring up Rafael Hidalgo, Jessica Vitalik, Dwayne Long, Kinsey Gunther, Zach Schutz, Larissa Hawley, people are going to be like, who are these people? I've never heard of these people before, because they're no names. They're fake idols. They're fake celebrities in this fake business. And that's the only way they get name recognition. So you said it took you about 2 months to find another job. So, what was that time like? Because you're obviously looking for another job, but unlike I'd say 90 some percent of other job seekers are also carrying around this really weird experience that is making you feel guilty and making you feel like, I don't know what the hell that just was, but now I'm stuck with it. So how did you kind of move between those two things mentally?
Yeah, great question. For me, I think first off, in like the first 2 weeks, I felt like not doing anything because like Smart Circle just like controlled like every aspect of my life back then. Like I felt like I didn't have a lot of free time. So, like those first 2 weeks, like I was just like kind of like relaxing early January, like where it was just like, you know, I want like my body felt like I was just like, I need some like relaxation time and whatnot. I remember with your interview with Mike, the guy who was in Smart Circle for like 9 years, where you mentioned he like
Yeah.
took a vacation and whatnot. Like I felt the same way. I was like, I need like a little like break from just mental break from this. And then, like I wouldn't say the time period, between like the two jobs was necessarily a dark one, but it was kind of like it was always like kind of in the back of my mind. It was like I went through that. Like I really did. Like I subjected myself for like 3 months there, and then occasionally I get like the nightmare of me um being in Costco selling AT&T phones. But that's only happened a
Yeah.
couple times.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got a job early March, and so far I've been like very happy with it and whatnot. Like I don't even get like paid a ton there, but like I like the first week there, I made more money than I did like in any of my weeks at Smart Circle. So like that alone makes it more worth it. And then plus I get like additional benefits in this job, like healthcare and whatnot. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like just like that whole time period, it was just kind of like it's still kind of it's just like, it feels very surreal. I think that's the best way to describe it, where it was just like I really went through that and like,
Yeah.
you know, trying to describe it to like people who haven't, it's been like I didn't like initially tell like, my friends and family like what I went through. It was actually pretty recently. I told like everyone where I was like, oh yeah, this all happened. And then like in kind of like an interview style like this, where I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, this is exactly what I went through because like, my friends, as I mentioned earlier, thought that this is like a little sketchy, but again, they didn't really know the details. But then when I fully told them about it, they were like kind of fascinated that way too. They're like, what? Like that really exists? That's legal? Like they were like, shocked that this whole like, marketing conglomerate really can exist. But
Yeah.
yeah, overall, I definitely can't say I'm like 100% over it, but like I definitely feel like I'm probably in like a better headspace than like all the other owners who are probably like subjected to this for like multiple years, where like I can only imagine like what they went through, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and everybody handles it a little bit different. Some people are going to suppress it as long as they can. Some people are going to self-medicate, um, and some people are just going to try to ignore it. I mean, it's been almost 10 years since I left. The nightmares have stopped for the most part. Like every once in a while, I'll have the offhand dream where I'm like in morning Atmo, I know what it is and I'm going to quit, and I'm trying to come up with creative ways to quit, like maybe go to the field for a week and not do anything, and just get paid for it. Um, but yeah, I mean, my Smart Circle memories are becoming increasingly hazy, and I'm grateful for that because I don't really want to remember that time in my life, um, for all the reasons, not just the field and all that stuff, but personal lives too, because it wrecks your personal lives. It wrecks your relationships. Um, but I'm glad to hear that you're doing better. I'm glad that you found employment, and that even though it still comes up mentally, you're at least free from it. You don't have you never have to go to Costco again. And that was one of the things I really liked when I left Smart Circle was, man, I don't ever have to go to Sam's Club ever again. And I'm so
Yeah,
grateful for that.
I don't even think I've stepped foot in a Costco ever since then. I actually have membership, but I'm just like, I was like, hey, you to my friends and family, I was like, yeah, you guys can use it for the time being, right? Like, I was like, just I just don't want to like be there. It's just kind of like because you just like I feel like when you are, it just kind of like just takes you back, like that like whole
Mhm.
meme you see in like Ratatouille, where it's like the flashback all at once. I don't know if you ever seen it, but like
Oh yeah.
yeah, like I feel like when I see anything Costco related, it's kind of like just that experience, like just coming back to me. I definitely want to talk about the market manager that got promoted out the first week. I mentioned him earlier.
Okay.
I want to show this one, like want to tell people like just like kind of like the manipulation they use. So they like in my first week there, they had like a little celebration. Like he was like, "Oh my god, he's gonna be the next great thing." Like he got promoted out. Like it was like a whole bunch of like I'm so proud of you, and like he getting promoted out. He was like leaving that weekend. He got promoted out to I think Portland if I remember correctly, but yeah, and then like in like his like little goodbye ceremony, like a lot of his team leaders like even crying about that. So like just like I guess like to show like how like emotionally invested you do get in this business, right? But what they would always do in morning meetings is that be like, oh, he's doing so well for himself out in Oregon, right? He's growing his business, he's doing such a good time. But every single day, not only would they pull up nationwide Costco stats, but they would also pull up stats from Just V's org, right? His name, very bottom of the list every single time. He pretty much his office would pretty much always roll a donut. I think the
Hmm.
most I ever saw his office do on that leaderboard was like 7 lines in 1 week, which is like something I would make in a week, right?
Yeah.
Like that number hardly ever went over three. And I was like, but they would always just keep feeding us like, oh, he's doing so well and whatnot. And then like, but you can like blatantly see that like he's not doing well. It was just kind of like, how profitable is he really out there, right? I think like, he was getting like a little bit of money from like Smart Circle around the office for like a couple months, but like how long is that gonna last, right? I don't not too sure if he was like not too sure if it's still in the business right now, but
Yeah.
from like what people I know, because I talked to a couple people on Reddit, like who are also in the same business as me, they would be like, yeah, like he's fully brainwashed, and then I don't know, maybe he's like still in that, but yeah, his story definitely was a lot like the other owners you see on here, where they were sold an opportunity and then like they were not granted one. It was that like awful Fred Meyers campaign where you're like selling phones in like a parking lot and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And then like there's just a lot of other examples of like the company just like stupidly lying to like our face. Like the funniest impact ever. I find this so hilarious to this day. The funniest impact we ever ran was this one impact where they would talk about how this job, and this happened like 2 weeks before I left. So this is when I really knew like I need to get out of here, right? They ran this impact where they were like, this how this business is a better opportunity than becoming a lawyer and a doctor. And I was just like, all right, well, how is this gonna go? So they first start off by saying only 15% of people pass the bar exam. Like the bar exam's impossible to pass. And then I no joke, pull out my phone, and then I'm like, no, 66% of people pass the bar exam on their first try too, and then they go on to become like lawyers and whatnot. And then they were just kind of like they like dismiss that, but then they're like, oh, but you have to like spend so much money like on doing that, and which is true, but at the same time, it's like a lawyer is an actual career. This is not a career. This is a scam, right? And then they were like, oh, yeah, only like 10% of doctors actually graduate med school. And then I looked up the graduation rate and I forget what it was, but it certainly was way, way higher than 10%. And then like just the way they like just like, brazenly lied about that. And then like just this instantly dismissed that, which is like the whole like behavior control itself. Also,
Yeah.
one hilarious tidbit too was the other market manager. I spoke to a former rep there. For how I mentioned earlier, he was kind of like a cartoon villain. Like he my leader was like probably at least a nice guy in person. This guy was not. This guy was like the guy that had a position of power that really should not have. He was like the boss that really should not be the boss. He would yell at reps all the time in the office. I heard there was a story one time where um I was alone in the office after morning meeting. I was just staying back waiting to go to the field. There was only like two other people in the office, and then he like me and my leader like we just hear like tables and chairs flying from like the other side of the office, and then it's my the other market manager just going off on one of the reps, and then me and my leader did kind of like the Looney Tunes look, where we kind of like turn our head and we just kind of like look at each other and like just like don't say anything, right? But then like yeah, it was like instance like that where he was just like being like just like openly like abusive to his employees, and then the person I contacted on Reddit, who was a former employee of him, actually he told me, actually, she told me that he made a joke to her about how, because she was like very like, uh, disengaged with the whole business. She was like ready to quit. She wasn't getting paid anything, right? But then like this market manager made a joke where he was like, "Oh, but you need to grow your horns," and it was like, "Oh, is that a joke to like Devilcorp itself? Like grow your horns?" Like he was like self-aware of like how bad the business was, but he didn't care, which is
Mm,
why I call him like a cartoon villain, where he's like, yeah, he knows it's bad, but he doesn't care, right?
mhm.
So yeah, just like some hilarious tidbits like that. I obviously have a couple stories in the field, but I feel that everyone does, so it's not
Sure.
nothing necessarily special there. But like, yeah, overall, just like I described the workplace as very, I think I did this in my email too, but frat boy culture. That's what it was ultimately. Like, just
Yeah.
yeah, just like people running an office that really should not have been running an office, and the fact that this office was like one of the best in sales should speak volumes, in my opinion.